This is a scary story about a young boy who is terrified when inexplicable things start happening during the night when he is sleeping safely in his own bed. There was a very ordinary boy who lived a very ordinary life. He spent his days going to school, doing his homework, playing with his friends, reading books, watching TV, and sleeping. His father was a doctor, and his mother was a librarian. Every night when he went to bed, his mother and father would come to tuck him in and kiss him goodnight. They would switch off his light, and as they walked out the door, his father would always say, "Good night, sleep tight." His mother would say, "Don't let the bedbugs bite." One morning, when this ordinary boy was lying in his bed, something incomprehensible happened. He had just woken up when he suddenly had the strangest feeling that someone was lying next to him. When the boy opened his eyes, he was shocked to see an old man lying in the bed beside him, clutching high in his arms. In fright, the boy used all his strength to push the uninvited guest out of the bed. Wondering if he had been dreaming, the boy peered over the edge of the bed. The man was there, lying sprawled on the floor. He realized that the man was dead. There was a horrible smell coming from the corpse, and there were bugs crawling all over it. The boy screamed and then ran into his parents' bedroom and woke them up. His eyes welling with tears, he told them that he had just woken up in the arms of a corpse. His parents did not believe him at first, but the boy ran out and dragged the corpse back to their room. His parents were shocked by the sight of the dead body lying on the bedroom floor. His father had to get up, get dressed, and take the corpse down to the county morgue. For the rest of the day, the boy was trying to figure out how the corpse had wound up in his bed. Nobody could explain how this had happened. Was it some kind of sick joke? He wondered. Was somebody playing a trick on him, or was there a more terrifying explanation? Were there dark and supernatural forces at work? Try as he might, the boy could not find an answer to these questions. That night, as he lay in bed, his parents tucked him in and tried to reassure him. His father said, "Good night, I hope you sleep tight," and his others said, "Try not to let the bedbugs bite." After they left, the boy was still uneasy, but soon fell into a deep sleep. The next morning, he woke up to feel something cold and clammy draped around him. Again, he opened his eyes and was horrified to find himself in the arms of another corpse. Again, he shook his parents awake and told them what had happened. His mother and father were at a loss to explain their strange events. They kept asking, "How could a dead body get into your room? How is that possible? Who could have put it there? Did it get up and walk there of its own accord?" Scratching his head, the boy's father had to bring a corpse down to the county morgue yet again. The boy began dreading the thought of going to sleep at night. After his parents came in and said good night, he decided to stay awake all night in order to figure out what was going on. However, as the night wore on and morning approached, his eyelids grew heavy and began to close. Soon he was fast asleep, snoring peacefully. He woke up the next morning and discovered that he was lying in the arms of yet another rotting corpse. The boy was determined to get to the bottom of the mystery and came up with an ingenious plan. He found a long, thin piece of black thread and tied one end of it to his bed. He tied the other end to a glass on his bedroom shelf. During the night, if something touched the thread, it would pull the glass off the shelf, and the sound of the breaking glass would wake him. That night, the boy went to bed trembling with fear. His parents could do nothing to calm him down. His father said, "Good night, try to sleep tight." And his mother said, "I'm sure tonight the bedbugs won't bite." In the middle of the night, the boy was suddenly awakened by the sound of a glass shattering on the ground. He turned over in bed, just in time to catch his father struggling to place a rotting corpse under the covers next to him. The boy realized that his father had a very sick sense of humor. A teenage girl named Rosemary attended a high school in a small city in Canada. One day, her biology teacher announced that he was taking the entire class on a school trip. Everyone was delighted. The next day, a bus brought all of the students to a remote part of the countryside. The purpose of the trip was, of course, educational. The teacher told them they were going to explore a nature trail. As they walked along the trail, Rosemary was enjoying the fresh air and the time off from school. She was chatting happily to her best friend, Amanda. The two girls were caught up in conversation and started lagging behind. Somewhere along the way, they took a wrong turn and became separated from the rest of the group. The girls kept walking, hoping that they would eventually meet up with the rest of the class, but they just became more lost. Eventually, they came to a small pathway and were relieved when they saw that it led to a little cottage, set back amongst the trees. The walls were covered with ivy and the garden was overgrown. The doors and windows looked as if they hadn't been painted in decades. When they knocked on the door, a little old lady came out to greet them. She was very frail and stooped with age. They asked her if they could use her phone. The old woman invited them inside and offered them a cup of tea. The two girls were tired and accepted her offer without hesitation. Inside, the cottage was dirty and grimy. The floor was muddy and the fireplace was covered in soot. The old woman told him to sit down, and for some reason, as she hurried out to the kitchen, she said, "Keep your eyes shut." The girls wondered what she meant by that last comment. Curious, they looked around the room and their eyes settled on a large mirror that was standing in the corner. Somehow they couldn't seem to take their eyes off the mirror and sat there, quietly staring at their own reflections. In the mirror, their faces appeared strange and distorted. It looked as if their cheeks were covered with scratches. They couldn't seem to tear their eyes away from the unsettling image. They watched in horror. Their faces began to change rapidly. More scratches appeared, followed by large bruises and bleeding wounds. The two girls had a very bad feeling about this. Just then, Amanda turned her head and Rosemary saw something that terrified her. In the reflection, she saw that Amanda had a sharp knife sticking out of her eye, and her own face looked as if it had been crushed. They covered their eyes with their hands and started shaking and screaming. The old woman came hobbling back into the room, and when she looked at the two girls, she growled, "I told you to keep your eyes closed." Without another word, Rosemary and Amanda jumped to their feet and ran out of the house. They kept running, crashing through bushes and jumping over streams, not knowing where they were going. Eventually, they saw the school bus in the distance and breathed a sigh of relief. Their classmates were surprised to see the two girls come running across the fields. The teacher got angry with them and told the girls they had kept everybody waiting for over an hour. Rosemary and Amanda were just glad to be back with their classmates again. The school trip was over, so all of the students climbed on board and the bus drove off. By the next day, the two girls had almost forgotten about their scary incident with the old woman in the little cottage. However, exactly 1 week later, Rosemary and Amanda were found dead in their beds. Their sheets were stained with blood and their bodies were covered in scratches, bruises, and deep wounds. It was my first night driving a taxi. It was late and there were not a lot of people on street. I was about to go home, but I was hailed by a man in a dark street. He wore a dark-colored coat, collars up, and his hat was pulled low over eyes as if he didn't want anyone to see his face. He got into the back of my cab and I pulled off and started driving down the street. My passenger in back leaned forward and tapped me on the shoulder. I screamed and almost lost control of the cab, nearly hit a bus, drove up on the curb, and stopped just inches from a large plate glass window. I don't know why. I guess he spooked me. His touch was so cold and he smelled real bad, like something decaying, like a dead animal. For a few minutes, everything was silent in the cab. Then, still shaking, I said, "I'm sorry, but you scared the daylights out of me." I stared at him in the rearview mirror. His head was a silhouette against the back window. I couldn't see his eyes, just a black shadowy shape where his face should be. My passenger apologized, saying that he didn't realize a tap on the shoulder could be so scary. No, I said, "It's all my fault. This is my first day driving a taxi. For the last 25 years, I've driven a hearse. Where was it you wanted to go?" The man in back just said, "North Cemetery." I drove him there in silence. When we got there, he got out of the cab and told me to wait. "And if you don't wait, you'll be sorry," he said. Well, I didn't feel very comfortable, but I wanted the money, so I waited. After a while, he came back, and strange as it may sound, he seemed to be wiping something from his hands. As he slouched down in the shadows of my back seat, the man just said, "South Cemetery." So we drove, and when we got there, the same thing happened again. He told me to wait for him. I was feeling more and more uncomfortable, but I waited. I wondered what he could be doing in the cemetery so late at night. What business could he have there? He returned to the car, brushing something from his clothes. I didn't ask him any questions. He returned to the darkness of the back seat and seemed to be wiping something from his mouth. When he was done, he just said, "East Cemetery." Although very frightened, I was determined to get my money. My curiosity began to get the better of me, and despite my fears, I was determined to see what he was doing. So this time, I followed him into the dark cemetery. I tiptoed behind him, stepping softly through the long grass and the muck. I watched him as he walked silently among the headstones. He seemed to be looking for one in particular. He came to a fresh grave, then fell to his knees and used his hands to scrape and dig at the earth until he got down to the coffin. I was barely breathing, afraid he would hear me. I was terrified, but I couldn't run away. Me legs felt like dead weight. I was rooted to the spot. Rushing vibrantly, I saw him open the coffin lid and as he bent over the coffin, I could see inside it. I caught a glimpse of the sunk features of a fresh corpse lying in the open coffin. I was so terrified I couldn't move in darkness. Then the man stood up. Perhaps he heard me breathing. Maybe he heard the gravel crunch underneath my shoes. He came straight towards me quickly, almost running. But it didn't seem like running. It was as if he was gliding fast and silent over the grass. In seconds, he was upon me, grasping my shirt and pulling my face close to him. is I smelled his terrible decaying breath. I saw something dark and sticky dribbling from his mouth. I managed to stutter, "Are you a vampire?" "Yes," he screamed as he sank his fangs into my neck. I saw a sign in the window of the pet store. It read monkeys for sale. The store was selling them for 5 cents a piece. I thought that was odd since they were normally a couple thousand each. I bought 200. I like monkeys. I took my 200 monkeys home. I have a big car. I let one drive. He wasn't very smart. In fact, none of them were really bright. They kept punching themselves in the face. I laughed, then they punched me in the face. I stopped laughing. I herded them into my room. They didn't adapt very well to their new home. They screeched and jabbered. They hurled themselves off the couch at high speeds and slammed into the wall face first. Although humorous at first, it became boring after an hour. 2 hours later, I found out why all the monkeys were on sale. They all died. No apparent reason. They all just sort of dropped dead, kind of like when you buy a goldfish and it dies 5 hours later. Darn cheap monkeys. Naturally, I didn't know what to do. There were 200 dead monkeys lying all over my room, on the bed, in the dresser, hanging from my bookcase. It looked like I had 200 throw rugs. I had to get rid of them before my parents came home. I tried to flush one down the toilet. It didn't work. It got stuck. Now I had 1 dead, wet monkey and 199 dead, dry monkeys. Retry. I tried pretending that they were just stuffed anichimals that worked for a while, that is until they began to decompose. It started to smell real bad. I had to use the bathroom, but there was a dead monkey in the toilet, and I didn't want to call the plumber. I was too embarrassed. I tried to slow down the decomposition by freezing them. Unfortunately, there was only enough room in the freezer for 2 monkeys at a time, so I had to change them every 30 seconds. This wasn't very efficient. I also had to eat all the food in the freezer so it didn't go bad. Ride has tried burning them. Little did I know my bed was flammable. I had to extinguish the fire. Now I had 1 dead wet monkey in my toilet, 2 dead frozen monkeys in my freezer, and 197 dead charred monkeys in a pile on my bed. The smell was getting worse. I became irritated by my inability to dispose of my monkeys. I was also irritated because I couldn't use the bathroom. I punched one of my dead monkeys in the face. I felt better. I tried throwing them away, but the garbage man said that he wasn't allowed to dispose of charred monkeys. I told him that I had a wet one, but he said he couldn't take that either. I didn't bother asking about the frozen ones. I finally arrived at a solution. I gave them out as Christmas gifts. My friends didn't know quite what to say. They pretended they liked dead monkeys, but I could tell they were lying. Ingrate, so I punched them in the face. I like monkeys. Sifty-San is a funny, scary story for kids about a man named Sam who spends the night in an old haunted house in the woods. There was once a great big 2-story house about 10 miles from town. It was set way back from the roadside where it couldn't be seen. The house was sitting right on the edge of a lake and was surrounded by woods. There were rumors that it was haunted by a terrible ghost called Sifty-San. Nobody had ever spent the night in the house because the ghost would always drive them away. The man that owned the old place wanted to rent it out. He was very anxious to prove that it wasn't haunted and offered a great big reward to anybody that could stay in the house all night. Finally, he came across a man named Sam who had just come to town and had a reputation for being able to deal with ghosts. When the owner approached him, Sam struck a bargain. He said he would stay the night at the old haunted house if the owner gave him the reward money and bought him some food so he could cook himself some dinner. So, the owner went down to the grocery store and bought Sam a big sack of potatoes and a slab of dry salted bacon. That evening, Sam threw his sack full of grub over his shoulder and set out for the haunted house. When he got there, Sam opened the door, walked in, and started a fire in the fireplace so he could cook himself some dinner. Outside, a huge gust of wind shook the house and howled down the chimney. Sam shivered and threw another log on the fire. Just as the dinner was almost cooked, Sam heard a faint cry coming from the far side of the lake. He was a little scared, so he went around the house making sure all the doors and windows were locked. Then he heard the cry again. This time it was louder and nearer. That ghost better not tangle with me, he said to himself, because if he shows up around here, he's gonna be a goner. No sooner had the words left his mouth than Sam heard a sinister voice chanting, "I am Sifty-San. I'm here on the lake, but where's the ma'am?" Sam froze in place and listened. The wind picked up again, howling down the large chimney. "I am Sifty-San," the sinister voice hissed. "I'm here on the shore and I'm coming for the man." When Sam heard this, he started to get really nervous. He knew the ghost was talking about him. His armpits began to sweat. His eyes were shining like wet glass and his knees were knocking together like a sledgehammer. "I am Sifty-San," the terrible, howling voice called from the front of the house. "I'm here on the porch and I can see the man." Sam was stood by the window with a frying pan full of meat in one hand and a sack of potatoes in the other. He heard the front door burst open, and down the passageway came a mighty rush of cold air. "I am Sifty Sifty, Sam," a horrible, blood-chilling voice bellowed. "I'm here in the house, and I'm gonna kill the man." "Oh no, you ain't," shouted Sam as he was ran off down the road with the frying pan full of meat and the sack of potatoes. "Because I'm already gone." One day, a boy was browsing the internet when he came across a crazy website that had a lot of scary stories and urban legends. He wanted to leave a comment on one of the stories, so he joined the website and decided to call himself Devil 666. Almost immediately, he began to receive private messages from anonymous people saying, "I'll praise the Dark Lord and we love you, Satan." He was so frightened that he logged off the website and unplugged his internet connection. The next day, a group of Satanists showed up at his house. They forced their way inside, bowed down in front of the boy, and started worshiping him. After that, they killed his parents and sat around the house, smoking, drinking, and eating everything in the fridge. When night fell, they put on black robes, lit some black candles, and began reciting prayers backwards. The boy grew horns, pointy ears, and a tail, and started to smell like sulfur. A teenage girl tried to register on the website as unidentified victim. An hour later, several serial killers showed up at her house and had an argument about who was going to kill her. A fight ensued, and the serial killers began hacking and stabbing each other. While they were occupied, the girl took the opportunity to flee, but as she was running across the road, she was mowed down by a car. The police managed to scrape her bloody remains off the street, but because she wasn't carrying a wallet, they didn't know who she was or where she lived. They buried her in an unmarked grave, and for the rest of their lives, her parents wondered where she was. Another young girl who found the website gave herself the nickname Clown Lover 14. Within minutes, a gang of clowns were waiting outside her front door. When she refused to let them in, they started peeking in the mailbox, drooling at the mouth and telling her how cute she was. Her mother called the police, and most of the clowns were arrested. However, the next day when she was on her way to school, a big black van pulled over and blocked her path. She tried to run, but a fat, hairy clown got out and chased after her. He abducted her, and a few days later, her dead body was found by the side of the road. A married man joined the website, and for some reason, he called himself Joanna Cootie. All of a sudden, he started receiving creepy messages from 13-year-old boys who were flirting with him. He needed to go to the toilet, but when he walked into the bathroom and caught sight of himself in the mirror, he was horrified. He had long blonde hair and an ample bosom. He immediately ran into the kitchen to tell his wife. The minute she laid eyes on him, she attacked him and started screaming, "I knew he was cheating on me." He tried to explain, but she slapped his face and pulled his hair. After a while, the two women sat down at the kitchen table, drank a bottle of wine together, and cried bitterly about how terrible men were. After that, whenever people joined the website, they thought very carefully before choosing a username. One morning, the residents of a small town got a printed flyer in the mail. It was a brochure advertising cookies for sale. The flyer said that people could order whatever cookies they wanted by phone or on the internet. The cookies would be delivered bright and early the next morning. The flyer promised that if you ordered cookies and they weren't delivered on time, you would get them for free. The residents of the town began ordering cookies, and the cookies began arriving in the mail. The cookie company delivered hundreds of cookies to the people every week. The business was a huge success, and everyone said that the cookies were the most delicious cookies they had ever tasted. One morning, the residents awoke to find something new in their mail. It was another printed flyer. This one was telling them about a new promotion the cookie company was running. The first customer to eat 1,000 cookies would win a trip to the cookie factory where they would receive a guided tour. Immediately, everyone in the town began eating as many cookies as they could stomach. Everybody wanted to be the first to eat 1,000 cookies and win a trip to the cookie factory to see where the cookies were manufactured. One young boy in particular was desperate to win the competition. Every day, he bought as many cookies as he could afford, and when they arrived in the mail, he crammed them into his mouth. The boy was so determined to win the competition that he ate cookies all day long. Anytime his mouth was empty, he would grab 2 or 3 cookies and shove them inside. He chomped and chewed and gobbled for 5 whole days until he had finally eaten 1,000 cookies. He won the competition, and the day on which he was to take his trip to the cookie factory finally arrived. He was given a guided tour around the entire complex. He saw the ovens in which they baked the cookies. They showed him the machines that added the sprinkles to the cookies. He watched as people injected jam and chocolate chips into the cookies. As his guide was leading him around the factory, the boy spotted a door that had a sign on it which read, "Cookie dough." Top secret ingredients, do not enter. The boy was curious about how the cookie dough was made, so the first chance he got, he evaded the guide and doubled back until he came to the door. Quietly, he opened the door and peered into the darkness. His eyes took a few seconds to adjust to the light. What he saw made him vomit on the floor. Inside the room, there was a huge conveyor belt, and in front of the conveyor belt stood a long line of men, and each man held a spoon, and the top of each man's head had been sawed off and their brains were exposed, and the men were spooning their brains into the cookie dough and mixing it in and spitting in it too. The horrified young boy ran to the nearest phone and called the police, and everyone in the cookie factory was arrested, especially the men with the spoons. Life for Chanel's. I can't fall back to sleep. I don't even remember what woke me up, but now that I'm awake, I can't fall back asleep no matter how hard I try. Counting sheep doesn't seem to help. It wouldn't even be that bad being awake in the middle of the night if I could get up, but I can't move a muscle. My body is rigid like a corpse. I can't even wiggle so much as a toe, and not for lack of trying. After the initial panic set in and passed, and I realized I wasn't dead, I racked my brain and tried to come up with an explanation for my immobility. I began to remember a lecture about dreams and sleep disorders in a psychology course I took freshman year. That's what made me think of sleep paralysis, which might help explain why the only part of my body I can move are my eyes. Maybe if I'd paid attention more in class, I'd be able to figure out how to raise myself from this state. As it is, I'm stuck waiting here for one of my roommates to come check up on me in the morning. Doesn't make for much of a plan, but it's all I've got. Certainly helps stop the growing pangs of fear that were spreading through my body, though in the pit of my stomach I still feel uneasy. There's an ominous, yet measured beep that I can just faintly hear. Too soft to be a fire alarm or a carbon monoxide detector, and it has been going on long enough that it's definitely not someone's car alarm. It feels both close and distant at the same time, like it is by my side but just out of reach. Regardless, this isn't the source of my uneasiness. No, it's something else keeping me awake, something else stirring in my chest giving me this sense of dread. It's like something is in the room with me, but I can't quite see it. Everything looks a little blurry, like things are moving too fast. There are other sounds like the soft pitter-patter of feet around me, and just outside of my room I can hear what sounds like whispering. Since I don't live alone and the walls are pretty thin, this usually wouldn't be such a strange occurrence, even this late at night. However, these voices aren't familiar. And the murmurs, though soft, somehow sound urgent. While I want to decipher what they're saying, deep down I know that even this is not what has me on edge. It's something in the air. Something is off. As I'm trying to pinpoint what is making me feel so restless, the sounds of shuffling feet, faint whispers, and even that incessant beeping all begin to fade away. My vision swims in darkness, begins to swirl around me, growing thicker. I can feel my chest tighten and my breath catch. I try to cry out, but no sound emits from my mouth. Not a scream nor a squeak. I try desperately to move even an inch, but my body doesn't respond. It feels as though I'm being held down by invisible hands. I'm smothered by an infinite darkness and a deafening silence. The pangs of fear I'd suppressed before grow and spread through my body with a burning fervor. The uneasiness that dwelled in the pit of my stomach is now full-blown terror, and just as I'm about to succumb to my fear and apparent demise, a bright light parts the sea of darkness, and I'm brought face to face with a woman. Her hair is a ghostly white, which reaches out into the infinite black surrounding her like wispy tendrils. Her skin is so pale it's almost transparent. I feel like I could make out the bones beneath her skin if I strained my eyes hard enough. But it's not her hair or her skin that has me captivated, it's her eyes or lack thereof. Where her eyes are supposed to be instead are just sunken. Black sockets, staring at them I feel as though I'm being sucked back into that never-ending void of black. With difficulty I pull my eyes away from them. Looking down, I notice that she is draped in an alabaster dress that matches her long white hair. The dress, though once was obviously beautiful, now lies in tatters, clinging to her body like vines on a gnarled tree. I raise my gaze to meet hers yet again. But before I can even try to utter a word, she raises a withered finger and points directly at me. Her thin lips part and she let out a low moan. As her mouth widens, the low moan begins to raise and pitch, like a kettle coming to boil. Her moan rapidly escalates into an otherworldly wail. Her maw has now become so impossibly wide it's cavernous. I shut my eyes in a desperate but futile attempt to block out the piercing sound. It continues for what feels like an eternity. I feel blood trickle out of my ears and down my neck. I hear her desperate wail reverberate in my skull, making my teeth rattle. Even with my eyes closed, I still see her ghostly visage looking at me. No, she's looking through me at my very soul. When I finally open my eyes, it's not to the oppressing darkness with the female specter, or even the familiarity of my room, but to what appears to be the inside of a hospital room. I try to move and immediately jostled by a sharp pain in my chest. A sharp cry passes my lips and my hand automatically reaches towards the pain in my chest. After a brief moment, I realize that I'm able to move again. I'm not allowed much time to reflect on my shock. However, as someone strides into my room at that moment, a pale man with a bald head looks down at me and smiles, showing off an impressively white set of teeth. He's dressed in a white overcoat and has a black dress shirt peeking out, just underneath. I wouldn't try to move if I was you. Trust me, I'm a professional. He says with a mischievous wink. As he steps closer, I can make out a name on a badge pin to his lapel. It reads Dawn with 2 N's. I turn my head and am greeted by a now familiar beeping. The heart monitor is connected to my chest by tubes and wires I can't quite see. There is also an oxygen mask lying just by my head. The doctor seemingly reads my thoughts and explains I had quite the night. I was wheeled in by paramedics last night after I'd collapsed in my room. One of my roommates had called 911. The shuffling of feet and the urgent voices all begin to make sense. You had a close call, he finishes, still smiling. I begin to straighten up slightly and he hands me a small cup of water. After a few sips, I tell him about my nightmare. His smile never fades as I talk. Sounds like you dreamt of a banshee, he says when I finish. He explains when I give him a quizzical look. Ghastly specters that let out the most blood-curdling cries. They're known as harbingers of death. His grin seems to grow wider as he talks, and I feel an uneasiness sprout in my chest. Despite their frightening appearance, they're merely warnings that death is around the corner. I begin to cough and reach for my chest again. Death doesn't like to be cheated. You mortals, you build structures and even create professions just to delay the inevitable. A pointless venture, wouldn't you agree? Visi awada really catched, and like catch at my chest and look back at the small paper cup of liquid that I realize now is not water. The man's skin begins to fall away and he reaches a skeletal finger to pluck each of his eyes out. He removes his white coat, letting it fall to the floor, and pulls up the hood of the black robe he's wearing. The creature looms over me and gently closes the lids of my eyes. I hope your next dream is a bit more pleasant. Later team. A mother took her eager 3-year-old son to a fast food restaurant for lunch. The boy finished his lunch quickly and asked his mom if he could go play in the play area. The restaurant had a special little play area at the side with some tunnels, a slide and a ball pit for kids filled with plastic balls. She watched as the boy crawled through the tunnels. It went down the slide and jumped into the ball pit. He jumped up and down on the brightly colored balls, dove into them, and burrowed down under them. The boy had been playing for about 10 minutes when all of a sudden he stopped and began to cry loudly. The mother rushed to her son, picked him up, and asked him what was wrong. The little boy just wailed and pointed to his butt. His mother pulled down his pants and saw 2 little red marks on one of his butt cheeks. She thought he must have just sat on something sharp, but just to be sure, she took him to the hospital. A doctor examined the little boy in the emergency room and told the mother that the marks on her son's butt were a snake bite. The doctor gave the boy an antidote for the snake poison and kept him in hospital overnight for observation. The next day, the boy's mother returned to the fast food restaurant to complain. She approached the counter and shouted at one of the teenagers who worked there. "My son was bitten by a snake in your ball pit," the woman screamed. "You should count yourself lucky, lady," said the teenager. "A kid got eaten by a shark in there last week." The man stumbled out of the smoldering car wreck and couldn't remember what had happened, what had caused the car crash. He just knew that he needed to find help. His wife was still trapped in the crumpled vehicle. He could see a house not too far away with a light still on, like a beacon in the darkness. So he stumbled towards it. His legs felt too weak to support him, but he trudged on through the field until he reached the front door of the old mansion. He banged with his fist on the wooden door and cried out for help in the lonely night. Eventually, the door creaked open, and a woman stood there, holding a candle, beckoning him to come inside. The woman's face was pale and her cheeks were hollow. Even though he was frightened, he stepped inside and shut the door behind him. "I was in a crash," he said. "I know," she replied, leading him into the dining room. "You saw it?" he asked. "I need to use your phone." "We have no phone," the woman said. "But my wife? She needs help. She's still in the car. I need to call an ambulance." "Nobody can help her," said the woman. "It's much too late now, Richard." "Too late," he cried. "Wait, how do you know my name?" "You've been here before," she said. "Many times. The woman must be crazy," he thought to himself. "Just my luck." "You come here every night," she said. "Just my luck," he thought. To be in a horrible car accident and the only person who can help is an insane woman in a creepy old house. Every night, she said, every night since the crash, she grabbed her by the shoulders and shook her. Don't you understand? I was in a car crash. My wife. The woman put her fingers to his lips and whispered, Don't you understand, Richard? I am your wife. He just stared at her dumbfounded. Don't you recognize me? She cried as she grabbed his collars and drew him close. Her face crumbled and the flesh fell away, revealing only a grinning skull. The man screamed, Don't you love me? She shrieked. Love me. The man pushed her away in horror and staggered backwards. He looked down at his hands and saw the flesh falling away, leaving only skeletal fingers. He put his hands to his face, but he had no face. His bony fingers just scraped against his skull. And he screamed and he screamed. And his screams grew fainter and fainter, and as the first rays of the morning sun shone in through the broken windows of the abandoned mansion, the two ghosts gradually disappeared into nothingness. But they would meet again, this doomed pair, this husband and wife, these haunted ghosts. Night after night, they would replay the same scene, each one haunting the other for all eternity. Car Ride is a story about a hitchhiker who is looking for a lift on a dark and stormy night. The man was standing on the side of the road, hitchhiking in the middle of a thunderstorm on a dark and moonless night. Time passed slowly and no cars went by. It was raining so hard he could hardly see his hand in front of his face. Suddenly, he saw the headlights of a car approaching over a nearby hill. The car was moving very slowly, approaching and appearing ghost-like in the rain. I slowly and silently crept toward him and stopped, wanting a ride real bad. The guy jumped in the car and closed the door. Only then did he realize that there was nobody behind the wheel, and no sound of the engine to be heard over the rain. Again, the car crept slowly forward and Guy was terrified, too scared to think of jumping out and running. The guy saw that the car was approaching a sharp curve and still too scared to jump out. He started to pray for his life, as he was sure the ghost car would go off the road and into the river, and he would surely drown. Hey. But just before the curve, a shadowy figure appeared at the driver's window and a ghostly hand reached in and turned the steering wheel, guiding the car safely around the bend. Then, just as silently, the hand disappeared through the window and the hitchhiker was alone again. Paralyzed with fear, the guy watched the hand reappear every time they reached a curve. Finally, the guy, scared to near death, had all he could take and jumped out of the car and ran to town. Wet and in shock, he went into the nearest barn and told everybody about his supernatural experience. A silence enveloped the room and everybody got goosebumps when they realized the guy was telling the truth about the strange car and the ghostly hand that guided it on its way. Just then, two men walked into the bar. They were dripping wet, and as they took off their rain gear, they looked around the room. Their eyes came to rest on the hitchhiker. "Look," said one of the men, "there's the idiot who jumped into our car when we were pushing it in the rain." There was a little girl who really loved dolls. She had a big collection of them in her bedroom. One day, while she was browsing through a shop on her own, she spotted a really beautiful doll. It would make a perfect addition to her collection. She only hoped she had enough money to buy it. "How much is that doll, ma'am?" she asked the old woman behind the counter. "This doll is not for sale," replied the woman. "But it's so beautiful," said the girl. "I really want it." The old woman became irritated. "I told you, it's not for sale," she said. "Why not?" persisted the girl. "Because this doll is cursed." "Well, that's okay, I don't mind. I'm not going to sell it to you, but if you really must have it, go ahead and take it. It's yours. But if something bad happens, don't blame me." Yes, thank you," said the girl, smiling as she grabbed the doll and walked out of the shop. The little girl was so delighted to get the doll for free that she ran all the way home, carrying it in her arms. When she got home to her apartment building, she went into the lobby. It was deserted. She stood there waiting for the elevator to arrive. The doors opened and she stepped inside, clutching her new doll tightly. The doors closed, but the elevator did not move. The little girl got scared and began trembling with fear. "Oh my God," she thought to herself. "Is this the curse of the doll?" Suddenly she felt the doll move in her arms. Ever so slowly, its head turned to face her. The little girl wanted to scream, but she couldn't make a sound. The doll's eyelids fluttered and opened. It stared at her with its lifeless glass eyes. Then its mouth opened and it said, "Push the button to go up, bitch." Trigger Alert is a creepy story about a man who sees a news report one night about a killer on the loose in the area and hears a noise downstairs. It was the middle of the night and I was in the bedroom trying to relax. I changed the channel on the TV and saw that the local news was on. At the bottom of the screen, there was a breaking news alert. "Murder on the loose hiding in the vicinity. Police warning everyone to be on the alert. Suspect is armed and dangerous." I was just drifting off to sleep when I was awakened by a strange noise downstairs. It sounded like there was someone in the house. At that moment, my heart began beating fast, and I broke into a cold sweat. Straining my ears to listen, I thought I heard another noise. It was the sound of a door creaking. It wasn't my imagination. There was an intruder in the house. I have to get out of here fast, I thought. I slipped off the bed as quietly as possible and crept towards the window. My body was shaking with fear, and I was hoping I didn't make any noise. Just then, I heard faint footsteps making their way up the stairs. It sounded like more than one person. At any second, they would burst through the door. I had to get away. I climbed out the window and onto the garage roof, moving as fast as I could without making too much noise. At the edge of the roof, I grabbed the drain pipe and lowered myself down until I dropped into the garden. As I paused, I looked up at the window I had just escaped from and saw the lights go on. That was close, I thought. A chill ran down my spine as I thought about what would have happened if they caught me. I made my way to the bottom of the garden and into the woods. Once I was safely hidden by the trees, I broke into a run. I pushed onwards, stumbling through the darkness, moving through the undergrowth, until I came to another housing estate. Clutching my knife, I headed towards another house. One dark Halloween night in 2003, a bus driver was traveling down a deserted street when he saw a beautiful young woman at the side of the road. He halted at the bus stop, and she climbed on board. The woman took a seat at the back of the bus and stared straight ahead. When the bus driver looked in his mirror, he noticed that the woman was staring directly at him, never blinking. But when he looked back over his shoulder, the woman was sitting with her back to him. The driver began to get really creeped out. He couldn't understand what was going on. Then, he came to the end of his route. It was the last stop, and he pulled over and opened the doors of the bus. The woman didn't get out. She just sat there motionless with her back to him. The driver walked towards the back of the bus and saw that the woman was covering her face with her hands. He tried talking to her, but she wouldn't answer. He took hold of her arms and tried to make her show her face. The woman refused and struggled out of his grip. Finally, she spoke. "You will not like what you see," and suddenly she dropped her hands and turned. Her face was horribly disfigured. Lumps of flesh were falling off, and her skeletal face could be seen beneath. It is said that they found the bus driver the next morning lying unconscious outside the bus. He spent 2 weeks in a coma, and when he awoke, he had lost all control of his senses. They put him in a mental institution, and this is the story he told from his cell. The Cell Phone is a short, scary horror story about a woman who notices something disturbing on her mobile after she allows her young son to play with it. There was a woman who had a 6-year-old son. One day, she bought a new mobile phone. When she came home from work, she started cooking dinner and left her phone down on the kitchen table. Her son came into the kitchen and saw the phone. He asked his mother if he could play with it. She told him that he could, as long as he did not call anyone or delete any text messages. Of course, the boy agreed and went off to his bedroom to play with the phone. Around 10 a.m. that night, she went upstairs to tuck in her son and found him fast asleep on his bed. The new cell phone was lying on the ground beside the bed. She picked it up and began browsing through the settings to make sure he had not deleted anything. She noticed some minor changes. He had changed the theme, the background, and had given her a new ringtone. She noticed that he had taken some pictures with the cell phone. She opened the images folder and browsed through them. How cute, she thought. He had been taking pictures of himself. Then she came across the last photo in the folder. When she first saw it, she couldn't quite believe it. Were her eyes playing tricks on her? It was a photograph of her son lying asleep on her bed. But the disturbing thing was what was lurking in the far left corner of the picture. It seemed to show the left side of a creepy old woman face. A girl went to the store to buy gloves. Her mom told her she could get any color, just not red. But when the girl saw a pair of red gloves at the store, she fell in love with them and bought them. When she neared her house, she saw it was on fire. Firefighters arrived, but they couldn't put out the flames. Suddenly, from behind a tree, a woman with a red face appeared. Everyone got scared and ran away, leaving only the girl. The woman claimed she could extinguish the fire if the girl promised to grant a single request afterward. The girl agreed. In no time, the fire was out. The woman then asked the girl to visit the cemetery at night and leave her gloves on a grave in the center. Terrified but more afraid of breaking the promise, the girl did as instructed. Suddenly, a tomb slid open. Revealing the red-faced woman, she tried to grab the girl, who managed to escape, but not before the woman shouted a curse that the girl's grandmother would die. The girl returned home to find her grandmother had passed away. At her grandmother's burial, she once again encountered the red-faced woman. The woman forewarned that the girl would die that very night. That evening, the girl went to bed and never woke up. She found herself buried, coming across her mother and grandmother. both with red faces just like hers. The trio then began haunting those who bought red gloves. A father and his daughter decided to buy a painting for Mom's birthday. They went to a store and asked, "Do you have any paintings?" "Sorry, we're out." They tried another store but had no luck there either. On their third attempt, they inquired again. "Do you have any paintings? We just sold the last one." Feeling dejected, they were about to leave when the cashier said, "Wait, I've got one in the back that I kept for myself. Let's have a look. Maybe you'll like it." They liked the painting and took it home, hanging it on the wall. That night, as Mom slept in the room with the painting, she felt a touch. Startled, she screamed and turned on the lights. To her horror, hands were sticking out from the painting. In panic, she called her husband, and together they cut off the painting's hands. The next day, they visited an old wise woman and told her everything. She advised, "Return the painting to the one who sold it to you and bless that person." The father returned to the store and noticed the cashier's hands were bandaged. He angrily threw the painting at her and made the sign of the cross. The cashier shrieked and ran to the back room, and that was the end of that. One morning, a girl was walking her younger brother to school. On the way, they noticed a black puddle in the middle of the road. As they walked past, the young boy stepped in the puddle and fell straight through. His horrified sister tried to catch him, but she tripped and fell in too. Later that day, the children's parents got a phone call from the school telling them that their kids were missing. The frantic parents went out and began to look for the children. They accidentally stepped into the black puddle and also disappeared. Some people who were driving by saw what had happened and phoned the police. A few minutes later, 2 policemen arrived and began searching the area. When they noticed the black puddle, they approached it cautiously. Peeking over the edge, they saw that it was a deep and narrow hole. At the bottom of the hole, they saw a man sitting there. He was gnawing on human bones.